Aviate, navigate, and communicate. It's an old adage, but true. Communication misunderstandings, failures, cost time, money, and at worst, compromise safety.
Communication is a big focus. It's quite often referred to as the glue that keeps the other parts together, if you like. So your decision making, your situation awareness, your teamwork all comes together through communication.
There's a famous quote that the biggest problem with communication is the assumption that it's happened.
So it's about understanding the cues as to what message we're getting, not just the words that are being said, but the way they're being said, the cadence or how quickly it's being said, the pitch of the words.
Communication is an often cited issue in aviation accidents, whether it's not enough communication, misunderstanding certain terms or phraseology, or too much.
One of the worst aviation accidents in history is where two 747s operated by KLM and Pan Am collided and killed 583 people at Tenerife. This accident brought human factors to the fore, and especially how we should communicate.
After the event, you find out that people had information that other people should have had. Even that taught skill of doing the air law exam, when do I call a PAN, when do I call a Mayday? And yet we've seen in practice a few times that people haven't done it when they should have, when they would have got a higher level of support from air traffic control. And so therefore the control is hamstrung in what they can actually do to help pilots in that situation, because they've just not wanted to speak up, or they've not wanted to draw attention to themselves. They've not wanted to be the person who's called a PAN or a Mayday when they didn't have to. So what? It's far better to have that outcome than to be the subject of an ATSB investigation.
You need to be clear and concise, and your tone really needs to convey whether it's an emergency or whether it's just a standard operation. You just need to get your message across in as few words as possible. Of course, it needs to be clear enough that we understand what needs to be said, but the frequency is very congested and only one person can talk at any one time, and the longer that somebody is talking, that means somebody else can't talk.
Good communication with the pilots is basically about standardised procedures. The pilots, once they're experienced, they know what's coming, they know what's going to happen at each stage of their flight, they know what to expect from us and we know what to expect from them. So it's all about standardised procedures, whether it be departure procedures or arrival procedures, standardised phraseology.
My advice to a new pilot here at Bankstown, relax. We're people on the other side as well, and we just want you to get to and from where you're going safely. The ground controller's talking to the tower controller as they're moving aircraft to and from the runway. The coordinator in the middle, he's making sure aircraft coming in from Sydney to Bankstown are acceptable to the controller, that he can actually separate what he already has, and same again for departures. And then there's a lot of communication between the two tower controllers as well, because it's a very small bit of sky. They need to know what's going on both sides. In the circuit, aircraft wanting to land, they might want to land on the northern side. We have to talk between ourselves to share the runway.
Aviation English is a different language, a different dialect that you have to learn and practice. And that language that we use in aviation is codified and very strict, and it changes. Every time there is a change in the AIP, there is a new little version of what should be said in a particular situation. That's because people notice that, oh well, there was a situation that was not quite covered, so we're adding something. So it's not to make things hard, it's actually to make things easier. You need to practice the calls before you go out there and make them on the radio. Possibly you need also to write down what ATC told you so that you are able to make the good readback calls. The videos that we have, I found that very useful because you can actually hear the different calls at the different locations that you're going. I had a student, his older sister actually, read the ATC calls, and he would make his readbacks and answering to her, and he learned very quickly. I think it was a training facility where they had the students riding their push bikes around the hangar and somebody playing the role of the air traffic controller with a megaphone, and the students riding around on their push bikes making the calls. That's a great idea because it actually simulates very well what happens when you're flying, that you have to do something, you have to move and keep your balance and make the call at the same time and think about what you're going to say at the same time as you do something. Yes. The accents and the pronunciation errors that people will make will depend on their original language. So aviation English, the ICAO pronunciation to some extent tries to mitigate that. So for instance, you're not supposed to say 1,000, you say 1,000. You're not supposed to say 3, you're supposed to say 3. And that's because in many languages, like mine in French, right, we don't make the distinction between the and the. And that's another reason why it's important for pilots to stick to it. It sounds strange, especially on the recording, on the video probably, but over the telephone you will notice that some frequencies get removed, and it's even worse on the radio, so that the difference between 9 and 5, so the V and the N, is gone when you're over the radio. And therefore, in order to distinguish between 9 and 5, you really have to say 9 and 5, otherwise they will sound the same. It's important to keep to the phraseology, to keep to aviation English and not use slang or terms that would be too conversational and that other people might not understand. The principle of being concise, precise and clear and speaking slowly enough that you can be understood should always prevail.
The set phraseology that's laid out, try to stick to that as much as possible, and if you do need to deviate from that, then try and still keep it simple and clear. Even if it's from an English speaker to an English speaker, there will be foreign carriers on the frequency as well, and they'll need to understand what's been said as well.
Communication is not one way, it's got to come back. So the important issues around readback, callback, are really important. So those fundamental principles that really form part of most human factors training courses is understanding limitations of communication and then understanding how communication is a two-way process.
You want to get the basics right. So at the end of the day, your first thing is to manage your personalities. We saw that in airtime. We saw Barry, the chief pilot, provide an opportunity to a couple of the crew to say, hey, is everything okay? Is everything okay? Are you managing okay with that personality type? As in John, the slightly cranky captain. So if you can manage your personalities and you can get that right, then you can actually do some formal training to enhance your ability to communicate.
Yeah, look, it's very important to tailor communication to the respective work groups. So engineers have a language of their own, pilots have a language of their own, administrative ops support have a language of their own, even our FEs, our flight examiners, they tend to have their own language.
It's very easy in a diverse workforce that we have that you can have splinter groups. Like it's very easy for a medical team to stay with the medical team and the aviation team to stay with the aviation team. But it's essential that you build that communication because at the end of the day you're one unit within an airframe. So if you don't have that on base, you're not going to have it in your airframes.
Due to the size of the organisation, it can be quite difficult to bring all the different people that touch the aircraft into the same room at the same time. I think that would be the ultimate if you could, because then you could have the engineering talking to the flight crew, talking to the cabin crew, talking to the load controller, to the caterer, that array. So what we do where able is very much to get the key people in the room. So whether that may be a pilot that's going as a first officer to command, to have some contact with a CSM, or the CSM to hear from the captains what their views are, definitely we try to work to that level. If we can't do that, then we build a lot of scenarios into the training so that people can kind of get an idea based on past events or past reports, what are the key challenges we're having in the environment. So we do a lot of like risk-based analysis, and then whatever those highest risks have been within the last 12 months, we'll build those scenarios into the training.
We have a number of tools that we use to communicate with our guys, so I think we're enabled fairly well. Obviously the standard email stuff, but we have a good system of providing alerts to our staff to make sure they're staying aware of all the operation issues that need to be passed on. That open reporting culture, I think that translates into good communication on all issues. So I think our crews communicate exceptionally with themselves. You know, on a day-to-day basis, we have formal processes for ensuring essential operational information is passed on between crews. So when a day shift is finished and the day shift is handing over to the night shift, there's always a formal brief to ensure that all the correct information is handed over to the oncoming crew. We overlay detailed shift briefings that make sure we cover the crewing, recencies, qualification issues, aircraft issues, any operational issues, such as restrictions with hospitals. They're briefed ad nauseum every day. We go back through, we cover all our safety issues on a daily basis with our crews as well. We focus a lot on our non-technical skills through our training cycles, and that's how we really reinforce crew communication, not only between the pilot and the crewman, but also between the flying crew and the medical team in the back. So aside from having very good people, I think we've enabled them with good systems.
I've put together a forum of safety managers involving every operator whether it's a private GA pilot, whether it's a helicopter pilot, or whether it is a flight training organisation. We've involved ATC now and council to make sure that everything around the airport where our students are walking, flying, exposed to a very unsafe environment, that we can improve that together. The basic principle of that forum is, instead of whinging, to discuss, find solutions and actually get them in place.
A very big part of communication is a significant module in the first knowledge base that we give all our crews. We go through and discuss what are the issues to do with communication, how can we communicate clearly, and also give them some tools and processes to use. So we actually train, so everybody in the entire organisation has a standardised set of responses.
As a captain, I always encourage input from my co-pilot or first officer. Don't be afraid to speak up if you've seen anything. In fact, I'll get cranky if you don't speak up, rather than getting cranky at you because you did speak up. So you've got to create that right environment for people to actually speak up and pass on that information.
What we also need to do though is empower the crew to feel comfortable to speak up. Part of our program, when we're giving the training to our individuals, is we actually provide them with tools to do that. And we reinforce it with some examples, some really good examples of where people, these are positive examples rather than showing like, oh, something crashed, oh, what could we have done better? We use some examples where there was an accident was avoided due to people speaking up, so it was a positive outcome. There's also pretty much a general rule, it only takes one person to say no.
So it's about opening up that communication and allowing people to give you the information that you need. So number one thing I'd say is briefings are very, very important. Even in a single pilot operation, brief yourself, have a plan. If you've got regular passengers that are travelling with you, there's an opportunity there for a single pilot to actually use those extra eyes and ears as an added safety margin. There's nothing wrong with the pilot turning around to the passengers and saying, okay, if you see wildlife, kangaroos, things like that, speak up.
Modern communication's interesting, it's texting and it's emailing, and we're getting used to some of that because, you know, we've now got a WhatsApp, and I'll make a little text and it goes to all my pilots on the WhatsApp and they'll all reply, and it's like, wow, how good's that? I've just spoken to 12 or 14 people quickly. It's a good method, but there's nothing beats eye to eye, sitting there heart to heart and having a chat, sitting in the cockpit with a young person and saying, hey, I'm coming today. Weather's a bit ordinary, I haven't seen how you're going for a while, I'll jump in, we'll call this a line check, we'll see how you're doing. And if you teach that person one thing on that flight, but you get a whole bunch of communication, you're hearing about his mum, his dad, his dog, you know, the missus, the husband, whatever, you're just learning about each other, you're communicating. And that opens the pathway to having those discussions that aren't always so easy to have. Because there's times when you've got to point out to somebody that, hey, you're great here and here, but we need to polish this bit. It's easier done if you've got a rapport. It's easier done if you have got a good pathway of communication.
Whenever we interact and we work with people, we need to be very mindful of their emotions and our relationships with them. So any opportunity we get, we should always try and make a deposit into their bank account. And that can be something as simple as referring to them as their first name, asking them how their football team went on the weekend. Every time you do that, you make a deposit into their bank account and you strengthen their relationship. Because one day there's going to be something that comes up that is going to require you as a manager to maybe bring them into the office and have a chat. And ultimately that leads to a withdrawal from the bank account. You've just got to hope that as a manager, over time you've put in enough deposits into the bank account so that when you do have to bring them in and have that fairly hard conversation, they walk out of the office and say, well, that manager really cares for me. He thinks a lot about me because he always asks me how I'm going. Today he pulled me in, which must mean I've done something wrong. And when that happens, you still end up in a situation where the employee still has respect for you and takes the conversation really well. If over time you've never made the deposits into the bank account, then that employee or student is going to walk out and essentially not respect you. So in essence, what you want to ensure is that after a withdrawal, their bank account's still in credit. If you go one step further than that, by always investing in your staff or your students, strengthening those relationships, like any bank account, it accrues interest. So what you invariably find is that your staff members whom you've invested in heavily will go the extra mile for you.
And of course, always remember the old adage, aviate, navigate, communicate. Communicate comes after flying the aircraft and knowing where you are and knowing where you're going. That's really, really important.